When my son Marcus stood in my living room and demanded I start paying him $200 monthly rent or get out in 30 days, I realized the grateful boy I'd sacrificed everything to raise had become a stranger driven by greed. But what Marcus didn't know was that the broke old lady he was trying to evict had spent 40 years building one of the most successful catering empires in the state, and the business empire I'd secretly been planning would soon teach him exactly why you should never underestimate a mother's love or a woman's quiet determination. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had family turn on you when you least expected it. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story of how one mother's strategic patience turned her son's cruelty into the biggest lesson of his life will leave you speechless. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 70 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about heartbreak. I'd buried my husband David 3 years ago after 42 years of marriage. I'd watched my small catering business that we'd built together from our kitchen table grow into something I was proud of, then sold it to spend David's final years focused on what truly mattered, time with the man I loved. I'd navigated the strange, hollow feeling of widowhood, where every morning you wake up reaching for someone who's no longer there. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the cold. Calculation in my only child's eyes as he stood in my modest riverside home on a gray Tuesday morning in October, holding papers he'd clearly had prepared by a lawyer. I was in my kitchen, making Marcus his favorite blueberry pancakes just like I had every Tuesday for the past 3 years since David's passing. It had become our tradition. Marcus would stop by before work, we'd have breakfast together, and for an hour I could pretend I still had family who cared whether I lived or died. The kitchen smelled like butter and vanilla. The coffee was brewing in David's old percolator, and I was humming softly to myself, grateful for these small moments of connection with my son. The morning light streamed through the yellow curtains I'd sewn 30 years ago, illuminating the family photos that lined the windowsill. Pictures of Marcus's first day of school, his high school graduation, his wedding to Sarah 5 years ago. Photos of David and me building this life together, brick by brick, meal by meal, dream by dream. This kitchen had been the heart of our home, where homework was done at the scarred wooden table, where birthday cakes were frosted with extra love, where family decisions were made over steaming cups of coffee and plates of homemade food. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus said as he entered, but his tone was different, formal, distant. There was no kiss on the cheek, no compliment about the pancakes, no asking how I'd slept. Instead, he remained standing while I gestured toward his usual chair at the small dining table David had built with his own hands 30 years ago. I noticed he was wearing his expensive gray suit, the one Sarah had insisted he buy for important meetings, rather than his usual casual work clothes. His hair was perfectly styled, his briefcase polished leather instead of the worn canvas bag he'd carried for years. When had my son started looking more like a corporate lawyer than the warm-hearted boy who used to help me knead bread on Sunday mornings? "Of course, sweetheart," I said, plating his pancakes with the extra blueberries he'd always loved. "Sit down, breakfast is ready. You look tired. Has work been stressful?" Marcus didn't sit. He didn't even look at the food I'd prepared with such care, rising at 6 a.m. to make everything perfect for his arrival. Instead, he pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table with the kind of precision that reminded me uncomfortably of serving legal papers. The folder was thick, official-looking, the kind that meant business rather than family. "Mom, I've been doing some thinking, and I've made some decisions about our arrangement here. Our arrangement. Not visiting Mom. Not spending time together. Not taking care of family. An arrangement." The word hit me like a slap, cold and transactional, reducing 3 years of shared grief and mutual support to something that sounded like a business contract. I set down the syrup pitcher carefully, a cold feeling creeping up my spine like morning frost. "What kind of decisions, Marcus?" He opened the folder with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this moment, pulling out what looked like a rental agreement typed on official letterhead. His movements were precise, controlled, as if he'd practiced this conversation in front of a mirror. I've been carrying a lot of financial burden since Dad died. This house, your expenses, the upkeep, it's more than I can handle as a gift anymore. I need you to start contributing $200 a month in rent, or I'll need you to find somewhere else to live. The words hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and cruel that for a moment I wondered if I'd heard him correctly. I gripped the back of David's chair, the chair where he'd sat for thousands of meals, where he'd helped Marcus with homework, where he'd held my hand during his final weeks at home, and stared at my son as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. Rent. Marcus, this is my home. Your father and I bought this house when you were 5 years old. We raised you here. Every room in this house holds memories of our family, of the life we built together. My voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the tremor in it. This kitchen, where I was standing, was where I'd thrown Marcus his 6th birthday party, when David was deployed and couldn't be there. The living room beyond held the Christmas tree where we'd opened presents every December 25th for 35 years. The basement was where David had taught Marcus to use tools, where they'd built the treehouse that still stood in our backyard. How could he reduce all of that to a monthly payment? Actually, Marcus said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone I'd never heard from him before, the kind of voice people use when explaining simple concepts to children or the elderly. If you check the deed, the house has been in my name for the past 18 months. You signed the papers yourself, remember? For estate planning purposes, you said, to avoid probate complications. I did remember. Marcus had brought the papers right here to this same table, spreading them out next to my morning coffee, explaining that it was just a formality, a way to make sure the house stayed in the family, without legal hassles if something happened to me. Sarah had been with him that day, sitting quietly in the corner, watching as I signed document after document with complete trust in my son's guidance. It's just paperwork, Mom, he'd said then, his voice warm and reassuring. Nothing changes except we avoid the lawyers and taxes if something happens. The house stays in the family, just like you and Dad always wanted. I'd trusted him completely, signed without even reading the fine print because he was my son, my only child, the boy I'd given everything to raise. What parent doesn't trust their child when they say they're protecting the family's interests? That was supposed to be for estate planning, I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of what had happened began to dawn on me. You said it wouldn't change anything about me living here. You promised me nothing would change. Marcus shrugged, a gesture so callous and dismissive it took my breath away. It was the kind of shrug you give when discussing the weather, not when destroying your mother's sense of security and belonging in her own home. Plans change, Mom. I've got a family to think about now. Sarah and I are expecting our second child. The kids need college funds, and frankly, maintaining 2 households is financially irresponsible. You're 70 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house. It doesn't make practical sense. Sarah, his wife of 5 years, a woman who'd smiled sweetly at family dinners while making subtle comments about how much space I was wasting and how valuable the property had become in Riverside's booming real estate market. A woman who'd never liked that Marcus still came for our Tuesday breakfasts, who'd complained that I was too dependent on him for emotional support, who'd suggested more than once that I might be happier somewhere with people my own age. I'd tried to like Sarah. Truly, I had. When Marcus first brought her home, I'd welcomed her with open arms, desperate to expand our small family circle after David's death. I'd shared family recipes, included her in holiday traditions, offered to help with wedding planning. But Sarah had a way of making me feel like an intruder in my own home, always checking her phone when I spoke, always finding reasons why they couldn't stay long, always mentioning how much work it was to maintain such a big house. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as my world tilted on its axis. I understand money is tight with the new baby coming, but surely we can work something out. Maybe I could help with the children, or contribute in other ways. I could— Help with what? He interrupted. And for the first time, I heard actual contempt in his voice. Contempt directed at me, his mother, the woman who'd worked 16-hour days to pay for his education, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity. Mom, let's be realistic here. You're living on Social Security and Dad's pension. You don't have $200 a month to spare. You don't have any real income, any assets worth mentioning. The catering business is long gone, and you've been coasting on Dad's life insurance for 3 years. Coasting. As if the modest life I'd built in widowhood was somehow a moral failing. As if the decision to sell my successful catering company to care for David in his final illness had been selfish rather than loving. As if the choice to spend his last months holding his hand instead of chasing profits was something to be ashamed of. The catering business hadn't been just any business. Chen's Catering had employed 47 people at its peak, had exclusive contracts with the city's most prestigious venues, had catered everything from intimate wedding receptions to corporate events for 5,000 people. I'd built it from nothing, starting with dinner parties for David's colleagues, growing it meal by meal, client by client, until it was generating over $2 million annually. But when David was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, when the doctors said he had maybe 18 months, I'd made a choice. I'd sold the business to my longtime manager, Patricia Winters, for far less than it was worth because I wanted it to go to someone who understood its heart and soul. I'd used the money to make David's final months as comfortable and meaningful as possible. Trips to places we'd always wanted to see, time with family, the luxury of my undivided attention during his hardest days. It had been the right choice then, and it was still the right choice now. But apparently, my son saw it as evidence of my financial irresponsibility rather than proof of my priorities. I have some savings, I said quietly, though even as I spoke, I could see the dismissal in Marcus's eyes. Marcus's laugh was harsh, the kind of laugh that cuts rather than warms. Mom, I've seen your bank statements when I helped you with your taxes. You've got maybe $30,000 left. That's not savings. That's barely enough to get you into a decent assisted living facility. Assisted living. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. He'd already planned out my entire future, apparently. Not independent living in a small apartment where I could maintain some dignity and autonomy. Not a cozy seniors community where I might make friends and build a new life. Institutional care where I'd be someone else's problem, where my independence would be sacrificed to his convenience. I looked at the rental agreement he'd placed on the table, the same table where we'd done his homework when he was 8 years old, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to college, where we'd planned his wedding, where we'd shared thousands of meals as a family. The monthly amount was written in bold print, $200, due on the 1st of each month, with a 30-day notice period for non-payment. There were additional clauses about maintenance responsibilities, guest policies, utility payments, as if I were a tenant rather than the woman who'd raised him in this house. You've already had this drawn up by a lawyer, I observed, running my finger along the official letterhead. This wasn't a sudden decision made in emotional distress. This was calculated, planned, probably discussed at length with Sarah over dinners I hadn't been invited to. I wanted to make sure everything was legal and proper, Marcus replied, though he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable under my steady gaze. I'm not trying to hurt you, Mom. I'm just trying to be practical. If you can't afford the rent, there are options. There's a nice senior community about 20 minutes from here, Sunset Manor. I checked and they have availability. It would actually cost less than what I'm asking for rent here. Sunset Manor. I knew the place, a sprawling complex of identical units where elderly people went to wait for death, where activities were scheduled from morning to night to keep residents busy rather than fulfilled, where independence was gradually eroded in the name of safety and convenience. It was clean, well-managed, perfectly respectable. It was also the antithesis of everything David and I had worked to build. A home filled with love, memories, and purpose. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the careful way he'd prepared his documents. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the stubborn little boy who used to cross his arms and set his mouth in exactly that line when he didn't get his way. "Then I'll have to start eviction proceedings." "Mom, I don't want it to come to that, but I have to think about my family's future. Sarah's going to quit her job after the baby comes, which means we'll be down to one income. We need the rental income from this house, or we need to sell it and find a place that's more financially sensible." Sell it. The words hit me like another physical blow. The house where David had carried me over the threshold as a young bride, nervous and excited about our future together. Where Marcus had taken his first steps, holding on to David's outstretched hands. Where we'd painted nursery walls and built swing sets and hosted birthday parties that spilled out into the backyard. Where David had died peacefully in our bedroom, holding my hand and telling me he loved me one last time. This house wasn't just real estate to be optimized for maximum financial return. It was the repository of our family's history, the foundation upon which we'd built our lives together. Every room held stories. Every corner contained memories that couldn't be replaced or replicated. The scratches on the door frame where we'd measured Marcus's height each birthday. The dent in the wall where he'd thrown a baseball despite being told repeatedly not to play catch in the house. The garden where David and I had planted roses for our 10th anniversary, which bloomed faithfully every spring, like a promise kept. But, as I looked at my son's face, determined, defensive, already distant, I realized that those memories meant nothing to him now. He saw burden where I saw belonging, inefficiency where I saw home. I sat down heavily in my own chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. The pancakes I'd made with such care were growing cold, the coffee was getting bitter, and the son I'd raised with such love was treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. "You've already made up your mind," I said. It wasn't a question. The careful preparation, the legal documents, the researched alternatives. This wasn't a discussion. This was notification. "I'm sorry, Mom, but yes. This is the most practical solution for everyone involved. You'll be happier somewhere with people your own age, activities planned for you, medical staff nearby if you need help. And Sarah and I can start fresh here. Make this house a real family home again with children's laughter filling the rooms. A real family home again, as if my presence somehow made it less real, less valid, less worthy of being called home. As if the 35 years David and I had spent building our life here, raising our son here, loving each other here, were somehow inadequate compared to what Sarah and Marcus could create. I folded my hands in my lap, a gesture David used to say, made me look like I was praying. Maybe I was. Praying for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to respond with dignity to this devastating betrayal. "How long do I have?" 30 days should be plenty of time to make arrangements, Marcus said, his tone softening slightly, perhaps recognizing the devastation in my voice. "I know it seems sudden, but it's really for the best, Mom. You'll see. Once you're settled somewhere appropriate, you'll wonder why we didn't do this sooner." For the best. The same words every cruel person uses when they want to avoid admitting their selfishness, when they want to convince themselves that their convenience somehow serves a greater good. I looked at my son, this stranger wearing Marcus's face but speaking with Sarah's words, and made a decision that would change everything. But not the decision he expected. The old Margaret might have begged, might have cried and pleaded and promised to be less of a burden, might have accepted his version of reality and shuffled meekly off to Sunset Manor to spend her remaining years, feeling grateful for whatever scraps of attention her son might occasionally throw her way. But the woman sitting at this table wasn't just Marcus's mother. She was Margaret Chen, the same woman who'd built a catering empire from nothing, who'd negotiated million-dollar contracts, who'd managed staff and satisfied demanding clients, and solved logistical nightmares that would have broken weaker people. I'd just been dormant for 3 years, focused on grief and recovery, and the simple pleasure of Tuesday morning pancakes with my son. Marcus had just woken me up. "All right," I said quietly, my voice steady and calm. "I'll move out." Marcus blinked, clearly having prepared for tears, arguments, desperate bargaining. You will?" "Yes," I said, standing up with more dignity than I felt, smoothing my apron with hands that were steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "If that's what you want, Marcus, then that's what will happen. I'll be out within the week." "Within the week?" Now he looked concerned, perhaps realizing that his careful timeline was being disrupted. "Mom, you don't have to rush. I said 30. Days? You should take the time to find the right place, make proper arrangements." "No," I interrupted, my voice gaining strength with each word. "If I'm not wanted here, then there's no point in prolonging the inevitable. I'll make arrangements. Today." What Marcus didn't understand, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 43 years of being my son, was that when Margaret Chen made a decision, she didn't just make it, she made it strategically, with careful planning, complete commitment, and absolutely no room for half measures. It was a trait that had served me well in business, in marriage, in every major challenge I'd faced throughout my life. And now, apparently, in dealing with ungrateful children who'd forgotten where they came from. As Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to leave, skipping the breakfast I'd prepared with such care, his movements suddenly seeming hurried and uncomfortable, I was already making mental lists, phone calls to make, arrangements to finalize, pieces to move into position for a game he didn't even know had begun. He thought he was evicting a helpless old woman who would beg and plead for mercy, who would accept whatever crumbs he chose to offer. What he was actually doing was waking up a sleeping dragon who'd spent 40 years learning exactly how to build something from nothing, and how to take it all away just as efficiently. "I'll call you when I'm settled," I told him as he reached the door, clutching his briefcase like a shield. "Mom," Marcus said, turning back with what might have been regret flickering in his eyes, or perhaps just discomfort at how easily I'd accepted his ultimatum. "I know this seems harsh, but you'll understand eventually. This really is what's best. For everyone." I smiled at him then, the same smile I'd used with difficult clients who thought they could intimidate me. The same smile that had closed million-dollar deals and opened doors that seemed permanently locked. It was a smile that promised nothing and threatened everything, though Marcus was too inexperienced to recognize the difference. "I'm sure you're right, sweetheart," I said, my voice warm and maternal and absolutely terrifying to anyone who knew how to listen. "This will definitely be what's best for everyone." He left then, probably relieved that the confrontation had gone more smoothly than expected, already planning how he'd tell Sarah about his successful eviction of his troublesome mother. As his car disappeared down Maple Street, the same street, where he'd learned to ride a bicycle, where he'd run to catch the school bus, where he'd brought dates to meet his parents, I stood in my kitchen and began to plan. Marcus thought he'd solved his financial problems by evicting his mother. What he'd actually done was give me the perfect motivation to show him exactly what he'd thrown away when he chose greed over gratitude, money over family, Sarah's ambitions over his mother's love, and by the time I was finished, he'd understand that the broke old lady he'd dismissed so casually had more power than he'd ever imagined, more resources than he'd ever suspected, and more determination than he'd inherited despite sharing my DNA. The game was about to begin, and my ungrateful son had no idea he was playing against a master. After Marcus left, I stood in my kitchen for exactly 5 minutes, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The betrayal, the calculation. The casual cruelty of a son who'd forgotten that everything he was, everything he'd achieved, had been built on the foundation of his parents' sacrifices. Then I poured myself a cup of David's coffee, still strong and black the way he'd liked. It sat down at our table and began to make a list, because that's what Margaret Chen did when the world tried to knock her down. She got organized, got strategic, and got even. But to understand what I was capable of, what Marcus had unleashed, when he handed me those eviction papers, you need to know who I really was before I became just mom in his eyes. You need to understand the woman David had fallen in love with, the entrepreneur who'd built an empire from nothing, the strategist who'd never lost a battle that truly mattered. My story began 45 years ago, when I was 25 years, old and fresh off the boat, literally. David and I had immigrated from Hong Kong with 2 suitcases, limited English, and unlimited determination. He'd been offered a position as a junior engineer at Portland Construction, a job that would barely cover rent on a 1-bedroom apartment in the city's cheapest neighborhood. I'd had a degree in business administration that American employers looked at with polite skepticism, as if education from anywhere outside their borders was somehow inferior. But what I'd also had was something that couldn't be learned in any classroom: my grandmother's recipes and an understanding of food that went bone deep. In Hong Kong, I'd grown up in my family's restaurant, learning not just how to cook, but how to read people through their appetites, how to make every meal feel like a celebration, how to turn simple ingredients into memories that lasted a lifetime. Our first apartment in Riverside was a cramped space above Mrs. Patterson's bakery on Oak Street. The rent was $340 a month, which seemed impossible on David's $850 monthly salary after taxes. We had exactly $500 left after immigration fees and travel costs. Most people would have seen those numbers and panicked. I saw opportunity. "We're going to start a catering business," I announced to David 3 days after we'd arrived, spreading my grandmother's recipe cards across our tiny kitchen table like a battle plan. David, bless his heart, looked at our empty bank account and our complete lack of professional kitchen equipment and said, "When do we start?" The first Chen's catering event was Mrs. Patterson's daughter's wedding reception. 60 people, $500 budget, to be held in the church basement. I spent our last $200 on ingredients and borrowed every pot, pan, and serving dish I could find. David took a day off work, unpaid because he hadn't accrued vacation time yet, to help me cook and serve. The menu was simple: my grandmother's honey walnut shrimp, beef and broccoli that would make grown men weep, fried rice that somehow tasted like it contained secrets, and egg rolls that were so perfectly crispy they sounded like autumn leaves when you bit into them. For dessert, I made traditional almond cookies alongside a chocolate cake that fused East and West in ways that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. When the last guest left that night, Mrs. Patterson handed me an envelope with $500 cash and 5 business cards from people who wanted to hire me for their own events. "Margaret," she said, "I've never seen people eat with such joy. You have a gift." That was the moment I knew we were going to make it in America. The business grew organically, the way the best businesses do, through word of mouth, exceptional quality, and an absolute refusal to compromise on standards. I learned to navigate American business customs while maintaining the authenticity that made our food special. I discovered which flavors translated universally and which needed cultural adaptation. Most importantly, I learned how to read my clients, how to understand not just what they ordered, but what they actually needed. Mrs. Henderson wanted elegant canapés for her book club, but what she really needed was to feel sophisticated and worldly in front of women who'd always made her feel provincial. So I created fusion appetizers that looked like French haute cuisine but tasted like comfort. And I taught her the proper names so she could impress her friends with her culinary knowledge. Mr. Kovac ordered simple sandwiches for his construction crew, but what he actually needed was to show his hardworking men that he valued them. So I made those sandwiches with the same care I'd put into a wedding feast: house-made bread, premium, meats, vegetables so fresh they still had garden dirt under their fingernails. His crew started looking forward to lunch instead of just tolerating it, and their productivity soared. The Riverside Community Center wanted cheap food for their fundraising, dinners, but what they really needed was to raise enough money to keep their youth programs running. So I donated my labor and charged only for ingredients, then created a menu so spectacular that people came back year after year, bringing friends, building community around shared meals. Those dinners became legendary, raising enough money to not just maintain programs, but expand them. Within 5 years, Chen's Catering had grown from a desperate immigrant side hustle to Riverside's most sought-after catering company. We'd moved from our apartment kitchen to a commercial space, from just David and me to a staff of 12, from serving church basements to handling the mayor's daughter's wedding reception. But the real milestone came when Pemberton Industries, the largest corporation in the Tri-City area, hired us for their annual shareholder meeting. 500 guests, including board members who flew in from New York and Los Angeles, media coverage, and a client who'd made it clear that failure wasn't an option. "Mrs. Chen," Harold Pemberton himself had said during our planning meeting, "I'm going to be frank with you. We chose your company because your prices were competitive and your references were impeccable. But this event will be attended by some of the most influential people in the business world. If anything goes wrong, if the service is slow, if the food is subpar, if there's even a hint of the amateurish, it won't just be bad for us. It will be the end of your company's reputation in this market." I'd looked at this man who thought he could intimidate me, this wealthy white executive who'd probably never had to build anything from nothing, who'd inherited his position and connections and assumed that gave him the right to threaten a small business owner. And I'd smiled. "Mr. Pemberton," I'd said, "by the end of this event, you'll understand why Chen's Catering doesn't just meet expectations. We exceed them in ways you didn't know were possible." The Pemberton Industries shareholder meeting became the stuff of local legend. I created a menu that showcased technical precision while maintaining approachability, dishes that impressed food critics but didn't alienate conservative Midwestern palates, seared duck breast with 5-spice reduction that had visiting executives asking for the recipe, vegetarian spring rolls so expertly crafted that dedicated carnivores requested seconds, a dessert course that began with traditional fortune cookies and ended with chocolate souffle infused with jasmine tea. But the real masterstroke was in the service. I'd noticed during our planning meetings that Pemberton Industries was struggling with internal divisions, the old guard resistant to modernization, younger executives frustrated by outdated practices, everyone so focused on corporate politics that they'd forgotten they were supposed to be on the same team. So I designed the service flow to encourage mingling, placed food stations strategically to break up cliques, and created shared plates. That required cooperation. By the end of the evening, board members who'd been feuding for months were collaborating on business solutions, and Harold Pemberton was shaking my hand with genuine respect. "Mrs. Chen," he'd said, "I've attended corporate events around the world, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished tonight. You didn't just feed us, you brought us together." The contracts that followed that evening transformed Chen's Catering from a local success story to a regional powerhouse. Pemberton Industries became a regular client, recommending us to their partners and competitors. Within 2 years, we had exclusive arrangements with the city's 3 largest hotels, contracts with the university for all major events, and a waiting list of private clients that stretched 6 months out. By the time Marcus turned 16, Chen's Catering employed 47 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue. We owned our commercial kitchen outright, had established relationships with suppliers across 3 states, and had built a reputation for excellence that opened doors throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the true measure of our success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the family we'd built along the way. David had left Portland Construction after 5 years to join the business full-time, handling logistics and client relations with the same engineering precision he'd applied to building projects. Marcus had grown up in our commercial kitchen, doing homework at prep tables, learning knife skills alongside our professional cooks, understanding from an early age that success came from hard work and attention to detail. Our staff wasn't just employees, they were extended family. Patricia Winters had started as a part-time server while finishing her business degree and had become my right hand, managing day-to-day operations with the same passion I brought to menu development. Roberto Gonzalez had begun as a prep cook and had evolved into our head chef, adding his own innovative touches to my traditional foundations. Maria Santos handled event coordination with organizational skills that would have impressed Fortune 500 executives. We celebrated their children's birthdays, attended their weddings, helped them through divorces and illnesses and financial emergencies. When Roberto's son needed surgery, we covered the medical bills without question. When Patricia wanted to go back to school for her MBA, we adjusted her schedule and helped with tuition. When Maria's husband was laid off, we created a new position for him in our maintenance department. This was how you built a business that lasted, by understanding that your success was inseparable from the success of the people who made it possible, by treating every employee like family and every client like a friend you wanted to impress, by never forgetting that behind every order was a human being with hopes and fears and the desire to feel special, even if just for one evening. The industry recognition followed naturally. Chefs Association awards for innovation and excellence. Small Business Owner of the Year from the Chamber of Commerce. Features in regional magazines that brought clients from as far away as Seattle and San Francisco. But the achievement I was most proud of was never written up in any publication. The fact that in 25 years of operation, Chen's Catering never had a single employee quit in anger, never had a client lawsuit, never had a health department violation, and never, ever served a meal that we weren't proud to put our name on. When Marcus graduated from college and started his career as an engineer, he'd grown up understanding that success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about building something that created value for others, that lifted up your community, that left the world a little better than you'd found it. He'd seen his parents start with nothing and create something meaningful through hard work, integrity, and genuine care for others, or so I'd thought. The decision to sell Chen's Catering hadn't been easy, but it had been right. When David was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, when the doctors gave us their timeline and their statistics, I knew immediately what mattered most. Patricia had been running day-to-day operations for years anyway. She understood the business, loved the staff, and had the vision to take it in new directions I'd never considered. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" David had asked when I'd told him about my decision to sell. We were sitting in our garden, watching the roses bloom for what we both knew might be his last spring. "I'm sure," I'd said, taking his hand in mine. "I built that business to create a good life for our family. Now I want to spend whatever time we have left actually living that good life together." The sale to Patricia had been structured to benefit everyone. She'd gotten the business at fair market value through a payment plan that worked with her finances. Our employees had kept their jobs with someone they trusted, and our clients had continued receiving the same quality service they'd come to expect. I'd walked away with enough money to ensure David's medical care wouldn't be a financial burden, and to provide security for my eventual widowhood. It had been the right choice then, and it remained the right choice now. But what Marcus had never understood, what he'd apparently forgotten in his rush to judge my financial irresponsibility, was that selling Chen's Catering didn't mean I'd lost my business acumen. It meant I'd deployed it in service of love rather than profit. The skills that had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing didn't disappear just because I'd chosen to focus on my dying husband instead of expanding market share. The strategic thinking that had outmaneuvered larger competitors didn't evaporate because I'd prioritized family over financial growth. The network of relationships I'd built over decades of excellent service didn't vanish because I'd stepped back from daily operations. They'd simply been dormant, waiting for the right moment to be reactivated. As I sat at my kitchen table, sipping David's coffee and watching the morning light shift across the photos that would soon need to be packed, away I began to make my calls. Because Margaret Chen didn't just accept defeat, she regrouped, reassessed, and returned stronger than before. The first call was to Patricia Winters, now the successful owner of what had been renamed Winters Catering, but still operated on the principles we'd established together. "Margaret," Patricia's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "How are you holding up? I've been meaning to call. It's been too long since we've had coffee." "I'm well, Patricia, though I find myself in an interesting situation. I wonder if you might have time for lunch today. I have a proposition that might interest you." Patricia had built Winters Catering into an even more successful operation than I'd achieved, expanding into corporate consulting and event planning services that went far beyond food service. She understood better than anyone what I was capable of when properly motivated. The second call was to Roberto Gonzalez, who'd eventually left Winters Catering to open his own restaurant, Romano's, which had become Riverside's most acclaimed dining establishment. Roberto had never forgotten who'd given him his first chance, who'd taught him that cooking was about more than following recipes. "Doña Margaret," Roberto said, using the respectful title he'd called me since his first day in our kitchen, "is everything okay? You sound different." "Everything is about to be very interesting, Roberto. Tell me, how would you feel about collaborating on a new venture? Something that would let us work together again?" The third call was to Maria Santos, who'd leveraged her event coordination experience into a successful wedding planning business. Maria understood logistics, understood people, and most importantly, understood loyalty. "Mrs. Chen, you sound excited about something," Maria observed after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "What are you planning?" "Something that will remind certain people why they should never underestimate family," I replied. "Are you free for dinner tomorrow? I have an opportunity that might appeal to your sense of justice." By noon, I'd made 17 phone calls to people who owed me favors, respected my